To the bill.
Delegate Bell, you have the floor.
Okay. Members of the House, this was the measure that we had some discussion on yesterday with regards to amendments, but didn't talk about the substance of the bill, and there was some discussion about how parole worked, and I've had a chance to talk to the members of the parole board to make sure that we got the facts right. First, I'd like to confirm who this will apply to. Now, the number prior to the delegates' patrons' amendment from yesterday was 305 offenders. It's an estimated of 280 offenders who are violent who will be affected by this. There's 6 nonviolent. I don't speak to them. I'm only speak to the violent offenders. Now, the violent offenders are broken out as follows, and there's an estimate for the sexual assault offenders because, as you know, we took out those where the victim was a child, but left in those where the victim was an adult. DOC didn't break it out that way, so my estimate is based on historic figures. First, there are 112 offenders who committed first-degree homicide. That's premeditated murder. As you know, we had an effort to take them out of this batch. That was rejected. Second, there are 50 who committed robbery. There are 12 who committed various forms of rape and sexual assault. There were 8 who committed rape, 1 who committed aggravated sexual battery, 1 who committed penetration with an inanimate object, 1 who committed forcible sodomy, 1 who committed sexual assault or attempted rape. There are 35 abductions. There are 31 second-degree homicides. There's 25 assaults. These would be felony assaults. 8 burglaries, 5 manslaughters, and 2 drug sales. Now, if this passes, how will this work? I talked to the parole board. Now, there's a lot of criminal lawyers in this room. Many of us are old enough to be in our 50s or older, but parole is something that mostly took place in the 90s, so it's been some time. So there's a statute that says when someone will first become eligible for parole based on the offenses and their overall record. By all accounts, everyone we just identified, all or almost all of them will be immediately eligible for parole under this bill. When that happens, the crime victim, who is registered through a system called VINE, V-I-N-E, will get notified as soon as the offender gets his eligibility. Where it's a murder case, usually the victim's mom or his dad. If it's a sexual assault case, it'll usually be the victim herself. Now, this law, if it passes, will go into effect on July 1st, and a few days later, these victims will start getting their notices, and then the phone calls will start. It'll go something like this. It'll be the mom, and she'll say, "Hey, Mike, just got this notice from the parole board. Yeah, he's coming up for parole hearing. No, it's actually been 22 years. Yeah, I know. We were told we'd never have to worry about this again, that it was over. Well, apparently the General Assembly changed the law. No, I don't know. No, I don't know. We just have to start getting together again." So then the phone will be hung up, and there'll be tears and anger and shouting and calls to other people and more calls, and cousins and neighbors and friends will be brought in because they've got to get their presentation and information to the parole board. Now, if you've ever spoken to the mother of a murdered child, you understand that they're never the same. Never, ever the same. Sometimes they keep a shrine in the bedroom. They don't move anything. Now, these crimes are all 20 years old, so probably those shrines have been broken down. People have moved. They've moved on. So more likely it's a box up in the attic or down in the basement where they go, and they start to get the pictures, the yearbooks, the report cards. Now, when a child is murdered, evidence is that it increases the rate of divorce. So some of the people won't be able to do this with their spouse. They'll have to call their spouse, from whom they divorced in part because of the murder. Now, talk about what they can assemble. They'll call siblings and cousins. If the person who was killed was a child, they'll try to track down that best friend he had in the 6th grade, because they're going to have to present this to the parole board. Now, the worst of this whole process, or there's lots of worsts, but the worst, is that it doesn't end. We had a dialogue on this yesterday, confirmed with the parole board. Once you're eligible, if you are not granted parole, you're eligible to apply the next year, and the next year, and the next year, every year thereafter. The parole board does have the power to extend that time period to 3 years. That's the longest it can be. So then you're appearing every 3 years. If it passes, And if it's signed into law by the governor, this bill will force crime victims who never asked for this role, certainly didn't want it, to be part of this process year after year, again and again, until they die, or until the defendant dies, or until he's released. Now, this bill has something new to the parole process. It would allow the prosecutor to present information. That's certainly not a bad thing, but it's been 20 years. Prosecutors move, prosecutors die, prosecutors go on the bench and are no longer really appropriate for doing that role. I was a prosecutor in the 90s. My entire arc as a legislator, from new backbenching bomb thrower to the chair of courts, has happened since those bills. I don't have files for that anymore. So here's what you have. Again, they will have to do it over and over. Now, this sounds theoretical, so I wanted to have a human face for this, and I want to share with you what a constituent of mine has shared with me. His name is John Sanders. He lives in Fluvanna. That's not where the crime that is involved in with the parole board occurred. But here's what he wanted to testify to in committee. Here's what he said. John Sanders. On November 4th, 1991, my 8-year-old son was murdered by his mother. While he was sleeping, she hit him over a dozen times with an axe, then poured gasoline on his bed and set it on fire. She was convicted of first-degree murder and arson and sentenced to 2 life sentences. Little did I know that 18 years later I would be receiving a letter stating that she was seeking parole. After 18 years, all of the sick feelings came rushing back. I cannot tell you all of the nightmares I had, even of the thought of her walking free. She was denied parole, and we asked and were granted that she'd not be able to seek parole for the maximum allowed 3 years. After that, the cycle has repeated itself with the same sick feelings for my family and myself. We have gone through several parole hearings, and during each one we are subjected to reliving the events over and over again. I know that after a hearing we have 2 good years before we will receive another letter from the correction office stating that once again she will be seeking parole. The cycle goes on. Every time she goes for parole, she has hope of being freed. For us, each time she goes before the parole board, we have the fear she will be freed. There's not been a day in the last 24 would be 29 years, that I have not thought about what my son must have gone through in his last moments of life. The parole hearings intensify those feelings by at least tenfold, so I beg you, do not change this law and subject other victims to the torture that these parole hearings have put my family and me through. Of course, that's just the hearings. The victims, of course, are even more worried that if they don't attend, or if they do and the parole board rules against them, they're going to run into the man who raped them in the grocery store, or the man who killed their son on a street corner. I hope you'll vote against this bill. Now, I'd like to end with a direct appeal to my friends across the aisle. I've been reading letters, press releases, your literature, the campaign, about your desire to make changes to the criminal justice system. And I can say with certainty, from watching the bills moving their way through, that there will be many, many chances to do that. It appears already there will be a bill, and I've spoken to the patron, to change the rules for marijuana possession. There's clearly going to be a bill to make it less punishing for people that commit grand larceny at certain levels. They're going to raise the larceny threshold. And those will come up, and we'll debate on them, and if the majority votes for them, they'll pass and become law on July 1st. But none of these will have the direct impact on crime victims as the bill you're about to vote on. This crime list, these are not victimless crimes. Behind each of these crimes is a mother or father grieving for the loss of their loved one. There's somebody who was herself attacked, raped, and this will force them to relive that trauma, that horror, effectively for the rest of their lives. I respectfully ask my Democratic friends to reconsider the engrossment vote they had yesterday and to vote against this bill. Thank you.